Sometimes you use buttons to access a garment. Now when you're using buttons, you must make sure that you've created 2 strips of fabric which are strong and thick. These are called button facings. Please see my button facings video for how to do this. So today we're going to learn how to make buttonholes. Need buttonholes if you're going to use buttons.
So you don't just cut holes?
No, you don't just cut holes. Gosh, no. Otherwise it'll start fraying.
When you do buttonholes, remember you want the buttonhole to go over the top of the button. So the buttonholes need to be on the right front, not on the left front, because the left front goes behind the right front. First things first, thread your machine with whatever thread you're using. Then decide how many buttons you're going to use. To decide how many buttons you're going to use, you will first need to measure the length of your button facing. This button facing is 51 centimeters long. So I will want to put a button every 10 centimeters, which means I will have 5 buttons. I've chosen to use these 5 buttons. They're all slightly different, but they're all roughly the same size. I'm going to use the biggest one. I'm going to start with the top button. If you're going to use buttons of different sizes, you'll need to use the largest one to create the buttonholes. If they are very much different sizes, so we have very small buttons and very big buttons, then you will have to match your button to the buttonhole that it's going to be with. Otherwise, a small button going through a big buttonhole will just slide straight through. So we're going to start at the top. I'm going to place my button where I would like it to go on the button facing, quite near the top because I want it to close quite tightly at the top. Then I get 2 pins and mark the top of the button and the bottom of the button. There we go. You want to make sure that your button fits between those 2 pins, because that is the size of the hole that we're going to cut. Earlier I decided that I was going to put my buttons 10 centimeters apart because I have 5 buttons and my button facing is 50 centimeters long. So divide by 5, you get 10 centimeters each. Make sure you measure from the same point to the same point. So for example, if you are measuring from the top of the buttonhole to the top of the next buttonhole, make sure that is what you always measure. So I'm going to put mine 10 centimeters apart. If I measure from the top of this buttonhole, I need to measure to the top of the next buttonhole. So I'm going to place my button just there at the bottom of 10 centimeters. Don't forget to pin at the top and the bottom of your button. Different machines have different ways of making buttonholes. So this machine, the Bernina B215, has got an automatic buttonhole button, which is number 11. When you press number 11, your LCD will look like this. So this here is the stitch number, so number 11. This is your stitch width, and this is your stitch length. As you can see, it's very wide, but it is not very long. Also, over here, so there's a rectangle here with a flashing line. Now that actually means that that is the side of the buttonhole that you're going to make first. Place your fabric under the presser foot to start sewing on the topmost pin. You want to also make sure that your presser foot is sitting right in the middle of your facing. As you sew, you will need to pull the fabric through slowly. And I emphasize slowly because you don't want to go too fast because you want those stitches to be quite close together. When you have finished that line of stitching, you press the reverse button and it will move you onto the next step. Your LCD should look like this. Now this line is flashing. This stitch is actually going back the way you came, but slightly to the right of your first line of stitching. When you've done that, press the back button again. Once you've done the top line of stitching, the machine will automatically take you on to this line of stitching. Just let the machine carry you through this process. When you have finished that step, press the reverse button again and your LCD will change and the bottom line will start to flash. You have now finished your buttonhole. So there is your first buttonhole. Make sure you trim off any loose threads and remove the pins. This here is a Bernina Sport. So this knob is your buttonhole selector. Remember to place your presser foot in the center of your button facing and start with the needle above the first pin. It should look like this. This is your button selector. Each one of the numbers around it are the different steps of a buttonhole. So 0 counts as not using buttonhole. When you turn to the first one, to the first setting, the top dial moves as well as the little dial on the top. Everything is preset for you. And as you move around, those dials continue to move. The other thing to know is that you cannot turn the dial anti-clockwise. You can't go backwards. You can't go from 0 to 5 or 5 to 4. You have to go all the way round clockwise. Next to the number 1 will be a zigzag and a buttonhole shape. That is the shape that you want your buttonhole to look like. Please also make sure that you change your stitch length to just below 0. Set your buttonhole selector to 1. The first stitch will do a zigzag. So if you find that your machine isn't pulling the fabric through, then your stitch is too short. You just need to just tweak it a little bit. Make sure your needle is up, then turn to stitch number 2. This does the bottom of your buttonhole. Then turn to stitch number 3, making sure that your needle is up, and this will take you backwards. So remember, when you're doing your buttonholes, you need to measure the whole length of the facing and divide it by however many buttons you want to use. So when you measure 10 centimeters, or however long you want it to be, you have to measure from the same point to the same point. So I'm measuring from the top of the buttonhole to the top of the buttonhole. So the next buttonhole is going to go here. That's how you keep track. That's right. So that's my button. Then you use don't forget to use the button, and you use it to measure your buttonhole to make sure it's the right size, and you pop the other pin at the bottom of the buttonhole. So that's how big I want my buttonhole to be. Make sure you've got your presser foot in the middle of the button facing, and you turn your buttonhole selector to number 1. Don't forget, you need to make sure your settings are correct. Then you just follow the fabric through and sew to the next pin. Make sure your needle is up, turn to the next setting. That does the bottom of the buttonhole. Turn to the next setting, making sure your needle is up, number 3. And this will take you up the other side of the buttonhole. When you get to your pin, make sure your needle's up, turn to number 4. Make sure your needle is up, turn to number 5. And that ends your buttonhole. Make sure you cut off any loose threads. Easy.